Welcome to Winning with Data Driven Marketing Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Was.ai Market Research. I'm Julie, your host in this podcast, and in every single episode, we talk to industry leaders, marketers, and growth experts in Asia about how they use data to enhance the ROI in their marketing activities. We bring you real case studies while giving you background on how these leaders built their career to where they are today. Joining me today is Henrik Petersen. He has more than 20 years of B2B marketing experience working with B2B SaaS software companies to build distinctive brands and fuel revenue growth. Henrik, welcome.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. It's really exciting to be on your podcast today.
Henrik, I know that recently you are now a fractional CMO, and when I look at your LinkedIn and have a conversations with you, you have so much experience across different companies. Can you walk us through and the audience a short stories about your career and where you are today?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, let me see how I can boil my 20 years down to a short story. But basically, I'm originally from Denmark. So I grew up in Denmark. But I came to Singapore in 1999. A bit of a coincidence, but basically I started out my career actually not in marketing, but in a small family-owned manufacturing company where I was looking after our supply chain planning, manufacturing planning. I'll say I quickly discovered an interest for software when we implemented a new business, or what's called an ERP software. And that quickly took me to a new job in the software industry. So first as an ERP consultant, but then joining the software company itself in Copenhagen, a company called Navision Software, and in product marketing. And that also then later in '99 gave me the opportunity to move to Singapore. And yeah, that's where I've been since '99. So since then I've spent, like you said, pretty much 20 plus years in, I would say, technology marketing, helping primarily technology companies, software companies, and other technology companies build their business in the Asia Pacific. And that includes companies like Microsoft, Zendesk, and a couple of startups here in Singapore, and also starting my own companies, getting my experience as a startup. So I feel like I've been both in very big companies and also small startups.
And is there a common point as you are in? I can see that we are very focused in B2B marketing and in software, right? Is there like a common question or common theme and pattern that you see across like the marketing challenges across all these companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably also what we're going to be talking about today, right? It's growth. How do B2B companies, and I'm primarily in B2B, how do they grow the business? And although I think in terms of just pure marketing, I think marketing is not that different, whether it's B2C or B2B. But then when you look at the core business, there are definitely differences in the way we do business. I think actually in B2B, there's a lot we can learn from B2C, where I think they do a lot better when it comes to market research and brand diagnosis, which is what we also be talking about today here. But I think that the fundamental, every time I meet a business owner, I work with a new startup, the question is always the same. How do we grow our business? How do we become a big brand? And how can we expand our business? And how can marketing help us do that?
And whenever and I myself always ask this question with my team as well. So so as the CMO, how do you usually approach this?
Yeah, so I think when I join in any company, I think the first step for us is actually to do diagnosis and is to understand what we'll also be talking about today here is what is the winning strategy of that company. Right. So and there's a lot of involved in that, but it's really understanding what we call the profit formula. How does a company make revenue, or how do they grow? I think very often we are too focused on products right? We look at our product and think we have the best product, but actually there's a lot more things in terms of how we how we use our resources, how we create processes, and how we leverage those capabilities in relation to our profit formula. And I think it's how you optimize that the best that determines whether you are successful or not.
I love it when you say the profit formula, and it's not just about the product, it's the product, the process, and a lot more things than that. Could you walk us through a little bit deeper about this, and maybe if you can throw in like an example of a case study, that would be very great for us to visualize how to build a profit formula.
Yes, a profit formula is, you can say, and a profit formula will change as the company also grow, right? So you could say when you start up, so when I joined, for example, the company Zendesk, which is a software company, a CRM software company, we were initially very focused on smaller, I'll say mid-sized companies. And it was really focused on, you could say, a self-service or a product-led growth, where it's about getting customers to come to a website, sign up, and basically get them started on their own. So you could say the profit formula for that, you can start formulating saying that means, it's all about optimizing that self-service experience. But also it means that, you're basically making a choice here, right? So we're not focusing on big companies. You're focusing on smaller companies, which also typically means a lower, order size or a customer lifetime value. And that also means then when you look at that profit formula, then you need to start thinking about what does it mean from a marketing perspective. Then maybe we cannot, for example, use an enterprise sales model to support that, because it's still too expensive in terms of the cost of acquiring the customer. Right. So that's you could say one way of looking at it is to say the profit formula for based on where we are as a business today is based on the type of customers we target, the market we play in, and also basically back to the strategy of the company. And then you will probably see that, and we saw that also at Zendesk, that will evolve over time as we grow. As we started to move up market, then we became more focused on winning bigger deals. Then you can start your profit formula starts to change. So now you can afford to maybe adjust also your go-to-market model and your marketing strategies around that, so that it aligns both with resources and processes.
Mm. And when, say, a company, sometimes when they are just starting out, right, it's often hard to choose whether or not it's top to bottom or bottoms up, whether or not I should go with product led, a lower CAC, a lower cost of acquisitions, versus should I go with enterprise sales? How would you approach this in terms of which strategy to go with? Or is there like a default mode that you should always try first?
No, I don't think there's necessarily a default mode, and I think actually sometimes that's the risk when we, as marketers or as business owners, is there's a tendency also to look outwards, to look at other companies and see what are they doing, and trying to apply their model to our business. And it doesn't necessarily work, right? Because we might have a different strategy, we might have a different profit formula that doesn't fit their model of doing this. Um, but I think it's back to like the question again is, what is the winning strategy? Because it's really back to who are you targeting, and what is it? What are we going to do that's going to make our solution a better offer for those customers in the segment we have chosen to target. So I think that's where it's back to that those strategic decisions. That's really important for the success of the company. So again, I think maybe also for the audience here is like really go back, think about what is your winning strategy, and maybe just to explain that. I think very often there's a tendency to kind of confuse planning with strategy, right? So the way I think to look at it is to say planning typically is where you're planning you're working, the things you control. So your resources, your people, right? We can make a plan about how many people we want to hire. We can plan what to do with our inventory. We can plan what to do with our processes. Right? These are all things we control. Strategy, on the other hand, is about the market. These are about things we don't control. right? So your strategy very often is influenced by the market, the customers, the competition, right? So that's why it can be it can feel a bit, what do you call that, nerve-wracking to kind of make strategy, because you are actually not in control of this. First part of it is really important to understand the market you are playing in, right? Because otherwise we can't really make good decisions around it. So I think very important to kind of differentiate, say, strategy is not planning. Planning is about your resources, how you use that. Strategy is about looking out at the market and decide, like I said, first, where do we want to play, right? So in marketing, we typically talk about who's our target audience, right? The second step is how, playing in that field, how are we going to provide, or how are we going to offer a better solution than anybody else in that market. So if I have to bring that back to marketing, specifically to marketing, right? So usually, again, they say it's a marketing strategy. Really, it's really quite simple. It's just who's our target audience, how are we going to win? We call that positioning, right? And third is what is our objectives. So if you go back to like what is a winning strategy? So winning strategy, of course, is that when we say winning, that means, I guess it kind of applies somebody is losing, right? So although business is not always a zero-sum game, right? Sometimes you can coexist with competitors, but like if you want to increase your market penetration, win more customers, you're basically stealing those or taking those away from somebody else. So that's the definition. I would say my definition of winning is that we are winning winning customers from the market, right? And our strategy is where we're going to do that and how we're going to do that.
So I'm gonna turn the table and ask you. So in this case, now that we know, not to confuse strategy and planning, and strategy is about choosing and understanding where do we really want to play in terms of target audience, positionings, and what's our objective, right? So how do we know which are the right strategy for us?
Yes, I think the first step is actually it's kind of get to terms with having a winning strategy. So I think very often, and if I look back at some of the companies I worked with, very often we actually don't have a winning strategy. We kind of just play to participate. And what I mean by this, it's very often when you look at companies and you listen to what our goals are, they're typically very internally focused. Right? So our goal might be we want to double our revenue next year. And although that might be like a very challenging or aggressive goal, that not necessarily doesn't mean we are winning, right? We could double our revenue, but competition might, do more than that and still win more market share than us, right? So for me, having that winning mindset is the first step in this one. Here is really to be clear about we're not just trying to grow and look at things internally, but we're really trying to say how do we grow our business in the context of what's happening in this space we are playing, right? So winning mindset means looking out at competition and seeing, like I said, is how do we win, but also how do we get better at serving customers in that space we choose. So I think is having that winning mindset, I think, is the first step, where I find, at least in my experience, a lot of companies don't really have a winning strategy. They just have a goal to get better than last year, right? So I think if I look back at some of the companies, even big companies I've been with, it's always just, we did this last year, so we're going to do this next year, right? Where we don't actually looking at it in the context of competition. And I think that's super important. And the reason why I think, especially for small brands, we have to look at some of the marketing principles, and one of them, which is called the law of double jeopardy. I know it sounds like maybe like a TV show, but it's actually an empirical research that shows that small brands has fewer customers than big brands. So that's the first, challenge we have, right? And then the challenge there is, if you have more customers, you typically also have more resources. You have more resources to invest in advertising, marketing, and go to market, right? So that's already a challenge as a new business. So you're starting out, is we have very few customers. If we're just starting out, of course, we don't have any customers, but right. So first of all, is how do we get more customers? The double or the second jeopardy is that small brands have slightly less loyal customers, right? So in marketing, we often talk about brand loyalty and what we can do, but reality actually is, and that's what empirical research has shown, is that brand loyalty is primarily a function of the brand size. So the more customers you have, the more loyal they are, right? And it's really back to the fact that as consumers, but also as customers in B2B, we tend to buy brands we know more about, and we know more about brands we buy, right? So it's so you say to overcome that as a new smaller brand, we really need to grow, but it's looking at how we grow. It's important here because it really comes down to increasing our market penetration, and market penetration different than market share. So market penetration means if there's 100 customers out there we can win, how do we get as many as those 100 customers, right? Whereas market share typically is made up of dollar value, right? So when you look at, normally when we talk about growth, we typically look at things like new customer acquisition, but we could also look at how to grow our existing customers. So if I go back to, again, when I was at Zendesk, right, we were focused very much on acquiring new customers. We also focus a lot on how do we keep expanding the existing customers and get them to buy more products, more users, right? So you increase that monthly subscription from this customer. But we're also looking at maybe introducing completely new products, right? So you can also grow through product development. You can also grow your business through what do you call that? Vertical integration. You could grow through mergers and acquisition, which we also did at Zendesk, where we would acquire other companies. But going back to that double jeopardy, right? As a small brand, it's super important for us. If we want to grow and become a big brand, we must have a constant focus on acquiring new customers. Doesn't mean we don't want to do existing customers, but it's in my experience, it's very easy sometimes as you grow to suddenly lose track of acquiring new customers, and you'll see sometimes sales getting very busy on just keep expanding their existing customers. So we had that actually at Zendesk, where we could see we kind of had a strategy of what we call land and expand. That means when instead of trying to go out and win a big customer and try and sell them everything in one go, we were just trying to get them on board, and then we would grow the customer, right? So it's quickly landing them as a customer, and then we'll expand over time. And what we saw, a lot of these startups that were joining us at that time were very, very small startups, but they were growing very fast, which means they're, we could basically, in some cases, you as an AE or as a sales rep, you could hit your quota by just basically working with your existing clients. But if you don't keep acquiring new customers at the same time, you're not growing as a brand.
Yep. I can see how law of double jeopardy sends some like some smaller companies who are listening to the podcast is like, oh no. But then I'm very glad that you give us the solutions at the afterwards. Can you talk a little bit about how do we design a successful land and expand strategy?
Yeah, I mean, so that's I think it's back to, again, both your profit formula to say where are you focusing, right? So are you focusing on just acquiring small businesses, or are you going after bigger accounts, for example, or bigger brands? But of course, a lot of it has to do with getting alignment between, for example, marketing and sales in terms of who we are targeting. And second, also a lot of it has to do with enablement, or especially of the sales team, to make sure that we don't, because it can be tempting to kind of say, like, let me just sell them everything at one go, right? And then you might, instead of landing this account next week, you might spend 3 months trying to get the whole deal. But then the risk is that sometimes you make the deal too big, and the customer maybe decides, maybe this is too risky, right? So part of that, I think the land and expand is that you make it very easy for the customer to kind of say, let me try this, let me get going, and also give them some quick wins so they kind of get hungry for let me do some more. So I think a lot of it has to do with enabling your field, the field team, so your marketing, your sales team.
Gotcha. So on that note, I also wanted to come back to you. You mentioned before we start the call, there are actually the three ideas around the questions around what is your winning strategy. So we have covered idea number one. I'm curious if you can walk us through your idea number two.
Yeah, so the second one is, and that's where, as I mentioned earlier, I find very often in B2C, they tend to do this maybe a little bit better sometimes than in B2B. But it's really what I call market oriented, which is, and again, it's, as my marketing professor told me, it's around understanding that you are not the customer, right? So as we look internally and say, I'm not the customer. So I think very often when we sit in marketing, we have a tendency to think that customers think like us, right? Or we have a lot of biases about our own brand. We think our own brand is fantastic, and we have our own idea about why customers actually buy our products, um, right? So I think being market oriented is that you recognize that we don't really understand the market, we don't understand the customer. So we need to have a process. We need to use our resources and create some processes um, for understanding the market, understand the customer, and also understand the competition. Um, so I think also it was Peter Drucker who said that the customer rarely buys what the company thinks they are selling, right? And I think that's back to like, do we really understand why people buy this product? And I remember like this was very early in my career, selling ERP software. Um, we would go to meet with prospects, and then we would have a team out there demonstrating the software. And sometimes we would demonstrate the software for half a day, sometimes a whole day, right? And when I think back at this now, it kind of tells me that we didn't really have a clue what the customer wanted or what they were trying to do. So we would just show them everything, hoping that at some point somebody would say, "That looks great. Can you please show more there?" Right? So I think being market oriented really means we have a organizational wide effort to keep gathering information about the customers, the market, and the competition. Right. So to be market oriented, I think it's a 3-step process. So the first one is, of course, we need to gather information, and there's a lot of ways you can do that. So in the past, I've used customer interviews, and I think that's especially for startups and small brands, right? We need to be mindful about the cost and the time of this. So the customer interviews, one-on-one meetings are probably the easiest to get started with, and also it can be very cost effective, and it's actually can be super effective in terms of really understanding what is it that the customer, why do customers buy our products or our services. But yeah, so as a company, you, depending on your size, so if you're a small startup, a small business, you can maybe start with just customer interviews. If you have more budget, you can use panel surveys sometimes to validate some of the findings you have found in your customer interviews. Right. So, and if I look back at how I've used this in the past, so again, if I look at Zendesk, we would basically have an effort. So every time we had customer events, we would use that as an opportunity to speak with the customers, ask them questions, right? And here I think a good place to start when you are looking at it, if you have customers, is to ask your most loyal customers, and you're like, why do you love our products? Why do you keep buying our services? What else did you look at when you were considering our products? Why did you choose us? And then just keep going deeper and deeper into to find out basically what's called the jobs theory. Like what is the job that they're trying to get done, right? But also understand the motivations and the triggers behind why they decided to look for a product or service to do this job, and also then understand what's the outcome they're trying to achieve by doing this. So I think customer interviews is definitely an I'll say relatively easy place to start. I'll say there are still some things you need to be aware of when you do custom interviews. There's a tendency to introduce a lot of bias. So, when we meet people, the way we ask the questions can sometimes influence the way people answer the questions. And also sometimes you have to be mindful that people sometimes they will answer questions in a way they think you want to hear, right? So these are things you need to be aware of course, when you do custom interviews, but it's still a super effective way to get started. I think once, and typically I'll say, if you do 15, 20 interviews, you start seeing a pattern. You start seeing the same kind of feedback coming back and again. So you start get a good view on like what is it actually we are trying to do, and what is the job to be done, and what's the motivation behind that. You can of course do more, but I think 15, 20 usually that's usually enough to get a good picture of this.
One of the common challenges I hear some of the companies that just don't do this is because they feel like, but I have immediate things that is sitting on my plate that perhaps give me a much more direct ROI than doing all these customer interviews that I'm not even sure if the insights will get me anywhere. I'm curious if you would hear challenges like this in your past, and how would you approach this?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's like I said, very often there is a tendency to think that we understand the market, we understand the customers. Maybe even because when we initially maybe started the business, we were kind of in the customer situation. So there's a tendency to think like, say, I come from that industry, I know what they need. Um, but I think it is risky, and especially later when you have to work on your winning strategy. If you don't get this right, you might go down the wrong path, right? But like I said, it doesn't have to be super complicated. You can kind of build it into, like I said, when you have customer events and you're meeting the customers anyway, it's more or less kind of like just have questions ready, have a more, what do you call that, a more proactive effort around how do you gather this information, right? So I think number one is how do you gather information or actually start gathering intel. The second part of being market oriented, it also makes sure that you actually disseminate, you share the information, the intelligence you learn with the rest of the organization, right? If this is just something that the marketing team gathers and then they don't share it with anybody, then it's not really helpful for the organization, right? And we want this to be a company-wide effort, right? So that that information needs to be shared, captured in a way that can be shared with the rest of the organization. And then I think thirdly, also important part is like that you actually act on it, right? So if you just have all that intel sitting and you're not actually doing anything with it, then also not very helpful. But I think it's super, and actually there's studies. I'll try and see if I can find a link. We can maybe share it in the recording. But there's actually a study that shows that companies who are market oriented are actually have a better profitability and are more successful. So there are studies done on this. So it's not just a fun idea I've come up with it. There's actually real research behind this. And I think also if you look at it, I said B2C companies actually tend to do this much better, I'll say, typically than B2B. So I think that's on the B2B side, this is something where we need to step up our game a little bit and really understand our market a little bit better. And I think the key thing here is, like I said, is for me is understanding the jobs to be done, or the job to be done. And I think again, if I look back at some of the companies I've been with, where the team in marketing sometimes we actually don't even know what it is we are selling, and even less we don't really understand why do customers actually buy our products, right? And I think again, if I go back to Zendesk, one thing we did really well there was to make sure that any new employee who joins the company goes through an onboarding where everybody learns how to demonstrate the product. So you actually have to go up in front of your, anybody else who joined the company in that month or that quarter, and do a demonstration of the software. And I think that's super powerful because it ensures that everybody who is in the company, doesn't matter if you're in finance, in HR, in marketing, you can actually explain to people you meet what it is you're doing and how we add value to the customer, right? But to do that also, again, it comes back to like, as a company, you really need to understand what is the job that the customer is trying to do and how is our product helping them do that. And I think once we have understood that, also it helps us in marketing create better messaging, right? We can explain, instead of just listing 20 features, we can actually explain exactly what it is, how we add value to the customer. It also helps whether it's your inside sales team, your account executives, and also make sure that when they are talking to customers, they really focus on what we know the customer are trying to do. So you get a much better response from the customer.
Is there like a case studies or application in the past that you can help us to visualize the successful case of after doing customer interviews or the likes of actually collecting such information and disseminating and actually applied it and see ROI?
Um, I'll, actually, I'm going to talk about it also later. But actually, one project I worked on was when we were basically building out our Zendesk business in Japan. Right. So like I said, I'll come back to it in the last part around diagnosis. But also, we really looked at saying like, how come the website conversion rate was a lot lower than what we saw in other markets. Right. So there we again talking to both resellers or partners, but also talking to customers. It helps us kind of uncover what was the friction in that process. Right. So basically, it came back to that the messaging on our website was didn't resonate with the target audience, and they basically didn't understand what we are talking about. So they would come to the website, not really be clear about what we are trying to tell them, and then basically leave again. Right. So by doing research, you've got a better understanding on what is it really they're trying to do, and how do we showcase them that this is actually something we can help them with. So we saw a dramatic improvement in basically in people signing up for our free trials, right? Which improved our conversion rate on website, but also improved our Google advertising campaigns. So it had a dramatic impact on inbound leads and the quality of those leads.
Awesome. In that sense, I can't wait to actually let's jump into the third idea that you would like to share with us today around building your winning strategy.
Yes, I think is what I call diagnosis, right? But it's also say if we want to create a winning strategy, we really need to understand the field that we are playing in, right? So, and I think you can say there's kind of two parts of this. So if you are a new marketing manager joining a company or a new brand manager joining a company, I think it's always a good idea to kind of sit down and really get a good understanding of the brand of the company you work for before you go into actually building your plan. And also in my work as working with other companies in terms of marketing, that's the first step. I think in the what I'll call a kind of a linear process, right? Is to do diagnosis before we do strategy, and we do our strategy before we come up with all our marketing tactics. And I think what I see a lot today is there's a tendency to jump straight into marketing tactics and just decide that we need to have some TikTok videos and some Google advertising, but actually before we really understand the strategic plan and have done real diagnosis. So that's the purpose of the first step is diagnosing the business. It's a little bit like sending your brand for a checkup at the doctor, right? So there's there's a lot of things we can look at, of course, and it depends maybe also on the size of your business. So if you're a small startup, you can keep this as a relatively simple process, and as you grow, it will probably become a more complicated or what do you call that, a comprehensive process. But I think there's a couple of key things that maybe we can run through. I think that's important to look at. So I think the first step is basically understanding we call it your brand DNA. What is your brand, right? And again, I know maybe if you're just a new startup, there isn't a lot of brand stories or heritage to work on, right? But imagine if, as a marketer, you're joining a company that's been around for a while. I think it's super important to understand, the story behind the brand. So very often here it's a good idea to speak with the founder to understand, like, why did they start the company? What was the values around the business? What were they really trying to do? Right. If you don't have the founder around anymore, you can do maybe some Google search, or you can talk to colleagues in the company, but really understand like what's behind the brand here. It doesn't mean you have to have a 20 slides PowerPoint around all kind of brand purpose and brand DNA and all this, but it's just a simple understanding of who we are as a brand, our core values. And I think more important also is to figure out what we call the distinct brand code or brand assets that we need to use for the in branding. And what I mean by that is distinct brand codes basically is, as you say, is your visual cues, your can be your logo, it can be your colors, it can be a sound, it could even be a smell, I guess, depending on your business, right? But what is it that if you don't, for example, mention the brand name, what is it that visually might tell people, say, that's the brand, right? So I think a good example that was talked about a little while back was if you know the chocolate, the Toblerone chocolate, that's in this yellow packaging, has this triangle shape, right? That's a good example of distinct brand assets. So when you see that in the shop or in advertising, you kind of recognize that straight away when you see that shape on that yellow color, right? So that's a good way of saying these are distinct brand assets that you need to apply. I think similar for even if you're a new startup, it's important to kind of figure out like what is your distinct brand assets that you need to apply. And then I think the other rule is you need to be consistently codifying or using those on everything you do. And again, here I see there's a tendency to, especially in marketing, to be like, we're a little bit tired of using that yellow color, so they'll make it blue, right? But then that's actually some of the worst you can do, because you might get tired of looking at a specific color or something, but the market, they don't look at your brand every day. So just because you're tired of it doesn't mean the market is tired of it, right? And it takes a really long time to build a brand. So having consistency and keep applying those distinct brand assets is super critical to building your brand. So those are some of the things that you could look at as around your brand. The second part, I think, comes back to what we talked about earlier about doing customer interviews, is to kind of figure out what are the brand attributes or characteristics of your brand. Not that what we think about the brand, but what the customer thinks about the brand, right? So here you should kind of try and figure out like, what are some of the attributes? If you ask customers, it might be easy to implement or expensive or whatever it could be, right? So these should be both positive and also negative attributes. So they kind of start giving you a picture of who we are as a brand. So like I said, when you interview customers, you start seeing, like I said, once you've done 15, 20 interviews, you start seeing that there's a few words that keep popping up. And those are typically what will be, you will kind of convert into your brand attributes that you can then use to figure out like who we are as a brand.
This is definitely interesting, because I can see in B2C, generally a lot of them do actually do research around, what do people think about the brand. But for B2B, things like brand attributes and what do people think about the brand are actually really not an often topic that people talk about.
Yeah,
and yet,
and I think
yeah.
No, yeah, I think you're right. I think in the last decade or something, there's been a tendency, especially in B2B, to be very focused on performance marketing. So very short-term ROI focused, and it's been the same in most of the companies I've been with. They've tended to kind of look at saying, how do we get the quickest ROI, right? So we keep optimizing around, I would say, the last part of the funnel, or what I call the bottom of the funnel, and not really spend a lot on building, increasing brand awareness. I think that's changing. I think a lot of companies are starting to realize that actually it doesn't work, right? So you kind of need to have both, right? I think it was recently, was it Airbnb that realized when they turned off all their performance marketing, actually things were still growing, right? And I think that's back to like, you actually, once you start building your brand and you reach a bigger audience, the rest, I mean, as long as you have what we call good physical availability, but then your brand will continue to grow. So I think there's a lot of power in building that brand, but I think historically a lot of B2B companies haven't put a lot of effort into this. But I think that's no, but just to say, like, but I think that's definitely a big part of your diagnosis, is to understand both who you are as a brand and what your brand is. And like I say, you don't have to overdo it. I think there's a tendency sometimes, especially if you bring in an agent, brand and this agency to help you with this, that they will produce a 20, 30, 40 page guide around this. That's probably overdoing it. I think especially for smaller brands, I think here's just understanding your core attributes and figuring out what your distinct brand assets are. and then just consistently apply that in all your advertising, your events, anywhere you go, right? You on your packaging and all that, so that it's you start building slowly start building your brand. The second part of that is to if you have the budget, is to do some brand tracking to understand the where you are in terms of brand awareness. Right, I know that brand tracking can cost quite a bit of money. I've done that before also, right? And I think today there's new tools out there that actually makes it a lot easier and more cost effective. I think historically it's been quite expensive. I've done brand or panel surveys where you do brand tracking. You basically ask a series of questions, which is bring you a really lot of insights around your brand and where you are. But like I said, it used to cost a lot, but I think price is coming down, which is also another reason why it's easier probably to do today. So I think those are the first part of understanding the business. A few other things that I think is good as if you're coming in as a business owner or a marketing manager, I think if you can, I know it can also be a challenge, but it's understanding your market size. How big is the market you are going after? So trying to size up the market. I know for some cases it can be tricky to understand, like how many customers do we think there are out there, and what's the value of those. But it's can be super helpful later on when you want to do what's called excess share of voice analysis, because that requires you to understand the total market and how much of that, basically your market penetration and your market share, how much of that do you have today. So if possible, try and get an estimate on how to do market sizing. Then the other things I will jump into is, especially when you talk to startups, they always talk about product market fit, right? Which is, I don't know, I feel like there's probably people out there who know more about this, but like it can be really difficult to figure out like when do you have product market fit, right? Usually if you have customers signing up and they stay with you as a customer, that's a good sign that you're offering some value, right? But I think if you go back to what we did at the under market orientation, which was to do customer interviews to understand what's the job to be done, I think it's super helpful also to kind of go back and say, so once we really understand what's the job they're trying to do, why do they hire our product to do this job? What's the motivation and what's the outcome they have? Try and link that back with the product, and just, so if you say instead of product market fit is market product fit, to say like, do we actually have a really good fit here, right? Does the product really do what the customers want to do, right? Does it do the job that they are looking for? But that again requires that you have a good understanding of why the customers actually buy your product. And then I'll say another, I think super helpful is back to what we talked about earlier, is that profit formula. And also, once you understand the product, the profit formula of your company, what is, especially for marketing, is important is to look at how do we apply that to our marketing approach. So like I said, if you are offering, for example, a freemium product, like we don't charge for the product, it's all about getting them to sign up for free. Maybe we make profit another way, or maybe we hope they will eventually convert into a paid product. It probably also means that you cannot afford to spend a lot on acquiring customers, right? So if you have or like when you had at Zendesk where we're offering a free trial to smaller businesses, right? Having an enterprise sales model where you have expensive marketing activities like roundtable events, expensive ads, and you have a BDR, have to call them, and that model just doesn't apply to your profit formula, right? So it's also good to kind of think through that to say, on the other hand, if we're targeting enterprise customers and our average deal size is $1 million, then of course we can afford to spend more, right? But I think sometimes, again, marketing, we have a tendency to jump straight into tactics and forget to analyze these things, right? And then the marketing tactics may not align with our profit formula. So thinking through that is, I think, also is a good exercise. That's relatively easy to do. And you can kind of, on a scale, kind of say, like, on one end, you have to have really, maybe even we can't afford to spend anything on marketing. It's all about creating content, viral marketing activities. And then as we grow up, we can start investing more in different channels, different types of marketing.
Sounds Good. That is like a lot of things for us to diagnose here, from brand tracking to market sizing to PMF to profit formula. Now, before this is very interesting to hear all the ideas you have around how to design a winning strategy. Before we wrap up, Henrik, is there anything that we haven't touched on that is on your mind around winning strategy?
No, I think just to kind of like summarize, right? So I think it's like I said, it's the reason I brought up these three ideas. I think it's first of all you can say it's a company mindset of having whether you have a winning strategy or you just have a strategy, right? So and because the winning mindset also, it's not just about winning, it's also about figuring out like how do we win actually by serving the customers better. And that kind of leads you into like that's really your mindset. That also leads you into being market oriented, because then you naturally kind of need to understand what do the customer think, what are they trying to do. So right, it makes you much more focused on what the customer is doing rather than just internally being focused on our products. Um, so I think so those things kind of go nicely together, right? And then I think the diagnosis is really kind of putting it all together to figure out both where we are right now, like where what's the brand health, where we at in terms of you can do things also like funnel analysis. Of course, you look at your revenue performance and all this, but also looking at how do you better align your profit formula with resources and processes in the company, right? So that when you are ready to make those decisions around your strategy, it's based on a solid foundation with good understanding of the market and also your competition. And then I think maybe the last point I'll just say is I think when it comes to strategy, this is something we have to kind of continually kind of monitoring, because like I said, we don't actually control the components of a strategy. The customers might change behavior, the competition might do something else, right? So you kind of have to keep monitoring this and then adjust your strategy as the market plays out. So super important to keep looking at this.
Great. Thank you for the summary. So we always have our lightning round of 4 questions before we wrap up today's episode. So Henry, are you ready for that?
I am ready, yeah, I think.
Yes. Question number 1. What are the key data or metrics that you monitor in marketing? Or in this case, brand building?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I mean, of course, we have a lot of metrics, but um, I think definitely, I would say, I mean, in the end, revenue always comes back as one of the key things to look at, right? I think so. Revenue performance, the health of I'll say what I call the funnel. So I think those are probably key metrics to look at. I think also your brand reach. So and you say your what do you call that? Market penetration, right? So are we reaching? Are we increasing our brand reach and our market penetration? I think those would be the other key metrics.
Second question. What advice would you give to someone who is interested in pursuing a career in marketing?
Uh, well, first of all, go ahead. It's a lot of fun, super interesting. But second, I'll say is get a good marketing education. I think like I said, in marketing, there's the tendency to be, we like new shiny things, I think, in marketing, right? So whether that's new software tools, new anything, but we also have a tendency to keep renaming things and coming up with new ideas. A lot of that, I think, and even sometimes when you read articles, even from very famous consulting firms and famous publishers, it's actually not based on empirical facts, right? So I think that's why I go back to actually have a good solid foundation that gives you an understanding of how marketing actually works. So evidence-based marketing. Um, so if you it's never too late to do this, right? So get a good marketing education. Doesn't have to be a full bachelor again if you already done that, but like just keep yourself up to date on uh, what are the evidence-based marketing principles that we operate, because there are more and more research coming out around this, and I think it's Today, a lot of us operate with based on marketing myth and thinking they're just not based on facts.
Talking about education, is the third question. What is the one marketing book that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I have it actually right next to me here. I don't know if you can see on camera here, but how brands grow. Right, there's a number of books you can get from here. You don't have to get them as a real books. I like to get real books, um, but that's a super book. Again, like I said, it's from Ehrenberg Bass Institute, who's actually doing a lot of research around evidence-based marketing. And I think that for me has been super helpful resource. I keep going back to it. And as I said, all the principles, also what I mentioned earlier around the double jeopardy, but there's a lot more in there you can learn from, but also around distinctive brand codes. There's a ton of research that I would recommend that people get familiar with. There's also, you can just go Google. There's a ton of things you can also, I say, recommend also searching for Roger Martin around strategy. He's a fantastic guy around playing to win and defining what is a marketing strategy or a strategy in general. But yeah, how brands grow, or I think the second one is Better Brand Health. Is another great book. I think every marketer should read.
Mm. Thank you for giving us even a bonus education here on book to read and resources to look at. Last question. What's your favorite AI powered tool or software?
Oh, yeah, good question. Yeah. So, I mean, the one I probably use the most is Grammarly. But I kind of both like it and also sometimes don't like it so much because I feel like it's constantly want to keep editing and keep making changes. So it's like you never finish. But I find that super helpful. Just having it running in the background. I have been playing around with a lot of AI tools lately to figure out what works. I'll say a lot of interesting stuff out there. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. They're not always perfect. So I think Grammarly is probably the one I kind of use everything when I write emails or articles, whatever it is.
On that note, for our listeners who want to follow and connect with you, what's the best way to do so?
Love to connect with listeners who have questions or anything. So feel free to go to LinkedIn and click either follow, or you're also welcome to connect. Happy to connect with people. Love to get questions or also learnings from other people. So please connect on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Henrik, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you so much for listening. If you find this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving us a review because this really can help other listeners to find the podcast. You can find all the episodes or learn more about this podcast at was.ai. See you in the next episode.